To welcome you. I know many of you. I'm Golomb Hoffman, and I'll moderate this conversation. And what could be better than a conversation about Agnon, framed by our love and admiration for Alan Mintz. So, we need to begin by taking note of the crisis in which we find ourselves at this moment, and to recognize also that we are meeting on November 9th. The date historically of another very dark moment, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the series of violent, is this okay? Anti-Jewish pogroms in 1938, instigated by the Nazis in Germany, Austria, and parts of Czechoslovakia. Out of our shared pain, I want to suggest that we take a moment of silence to remember all of those whom we have lost and to send our thoughts and prayers for the release of the hostages in Gaza. Thank you. Our gathering this afternoon is so much in the spirit of who Alan Mintz was, and continues to be, I think, exemplified for me in memories of the wonderful colloquium that took place at Brandeis in 1999, Reading Israel in America. I think David remembers that as well. Yes. A group of readers sharing thoughts about a set of shared texts. What could be better? And that led, of course, to the publication of Reading Hebrew Literature, critical discussions of 6 modern texts that came out in 2002. All of his life, Alan brought people together through his passion for reading and for Hebrew, sustaining and extending a literal and metaphysical geography of Hebrew language and literature. Looking back at his own beginnings, Alan took note of the contours of the Lithuanian Zionist Hebraist complex that shaped the New England city of Worcester, where he was born. After all, he noted, Hebrew was, and I'm quoting, the portable component of the Jewish national idea, and that quality made it highly suitable for export in the shabby valises of passionate young men who arrived on these shores from the cultural centers of Eastern Europe. The passions that animated those early Hebraists, some of them Alan's teachers, infused the story that brings us together today, Sefer She'avad, a book that was lost. Why did Alan and I choose that short story title as the title of our collection of Agnon stories? You will hear some interesting ideas from our speakers, and you may have your own, but I want to note at the outset how aptly it conveys the mixture of desire and loss that infuses literary experience and helps us understand the ways in which Agnon's writing captures the condition of our modernity. Of Agnon's autobiographical narrator, Alan notes that it is not the mother and her breast that form the first memory, but the bookcase and its contents. This is an erotics of language and of books that I think enmeshes us all with Hebrew and Jewish literary tradition. A book that was lost. This story of a material object opens access to history. A text is a fabric, a weave of words. A text takes shape out of the play of absence and presence. Allen approached Agnon's Ir Umloa, a city in its fullness, as a volume that exists to compensate for the loss of the Pinkas, the registry that was for centuries the record of life cycle events in Eastern European Jewish communities. Recognizing the materiality of the book as a Pinkas, Allen expands our sense of Agnon's writing to include the narrative arc, the large architectonic form, as he put it, of Ir Umloa as a new form of cultural history. For Agnon, for Allen, and for all of us, we see that writing is inevitably conditioned by loss, and yet we can also recognize that mourning and loss become a resource, a springboard for the creative act. We certainly feel the mixture of presence and absence in the elegant work that David Stern and Beverly Bailis carried out, framing the volume of Allen's uncollected essays, one of the books we're celebrating this afternoon. Beverly has observed that she and Susanna, and I think Amira and Avital, needed to map Allen's office in order to engage with the work of dismantling it. This is mapping as a kind of reading. It's an office as a text, there to be read, as Beverly put it. And we see it also in the work that Sheila Jelen, Jeffrey Sachs, and Wendy Zierler carried out in the really aptly titled volume, Building a City, Writings on Agnon's Buchach in memory of Alan L. Mintz. So, shall I introduce each person? And then, okay. So we're going to open, I think, with Jeffrey Sachs, who's joining us at a very late hour from Yerushalayim. And I just want to say a few words about Jeffrey, whom I have never met in person, but whom I have consulted more than once. Jeffrey Sachs, co-editor of Building a City, is the director of research at Beit Agnon in Yerushalayim. He's series editor of the Agnon Library at Toby Press and editor of the journal Tradition. He is the founding director of Atid, the Academy for Torah Initiatives and Directions, and its web yeshiva program. So why don't we begin with Jeffrey?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to all of you that are gathered there to honor our friend Alan. I'm sure you forgive me for my absence. I very much wanted to be with you, and I assume that you understand why I was not able to leave Israel at this time. Congratulations to Wendy and Sheila and to Beverly and David for the accomplishments that are represented in these volumes. Very, very appropriate testaments to our friend Alan. And I'm also pleased, I understand that Susanna and Avital and Amira are with us as well. And we hope that these accomplishments bring you a measure of comfort in the staggering absence of Alan. It's interesting that we've gathered to discuss this one little story, a book that was lost, as a way of talking about books that have been lost. And of course, we're mindful of the work that Alan had begun, but which, of course, sadly has not finished. It's interesting because Alan and I, we had this wonderful, for me, it was a wonderful collaborative relationship as we worked together on the Ir Umloa, the city in its fullness stories. And we actually had a disagreement about including that story Sefer She'avad in our collection of the stories of a city in its fullness. The original Hebrew story appears in the Hebrew volume, and when we prepared the English volume, which does not contain every single story from the Hebrew volume, we had a certain limit of how much could go in. Alan thought it should not be included. I'm not going to go into now the heart of that debate, but those of you that worked with Alan, even those like myself who were partners with him, even if we were not peers, you understand how collaborative he really was, and how he was so respectful of other people's opinions, and how he really created, what I think something in our line of work is sometimes frustratingly rare, a real true chavrusashaft of working together, of learning together, of arguing together in the best sense of the word, of trying to really get at some better product. In this particular case, Alan won. There were other things we disagreed about that he gave in to me, and my opinion prevailed. But in this particular case, Sefer She'avad was lost, at least lost from being recollected into the stories of Ir Umloa. And maybe if I'll have an opportunity to write up some of the ideas that I'm sharing or hinting at today, I'll go into why he thought that. But the idea of lost books is not lost. The idea of books lost because they go unwritten, because as physical objects they're destroyed, very often, of course, by fire. They're lost because they're somehow forgotten in this world, even as they are preserved in the next. They're lost because they're sent to a better place, but don't arrive. The postman can't fulfill his task, and the book doesn't show up at what becomes the National Library. For any variety of reasons, a book that is lost was so central. It was so, Agnon seems to have been so compulsively occupied with this idea, which grows out of his own life and populates stories across the canon. Of course, in 1929, in the Hafraot Terpat, the terrible uprisings here in the land of Israel, Agnon's home in Talpiot, not Beit Agnon, but a rented home down the block from what becomes Beit Agnon. The house was marauded. The family was rescued, although the Arab marauders stole everything of value, and just for the fun of it, tear down all of the bookshelves, flood the house by opening all of the faucets, and destroy his library. This, of course, was not the first library that he loses, but 5 years earlier, of course, in 1924, in the home he's living in Bad Homburg, outside of Frankfurt in Germany, there's a house fire. And with the house fire, he loses much property, all of his property, and his library of many thousands of volumes and manuscripts that had not been published. We're coming up this summer, we'll mark the 100th anniversary of this fire. And here in Jerusalem and in our activities online at Beit Agnon, we'll be dedicating a certain amount of attention to this. The house itself was noteworthy. The building itself, Agnon and his family occupied the top 2 floors of the building that was known as the Villa Imperiale. At one point in the 19th century, it was a kind of summer residence or vacation home of the Prince of Wales, of the son of Queen Victoria, who goes on to become King Edward VII. And because he used to rent the home or would borrow would stay in the home, it took on this nickname, the Villa Imperiale, so that when the building is destroyed, it becomes something of a news item. Now, this was interesting, and in our work trying to prepare for this year's 100th anniversary marking of this event, we started looking into it a little bit. Dan Leor, Agnon's biographer, who sadly passed away this past year, records that the fire took place on June 6th, 1924. June 6th was a Friday, and it was curious to me because Emuna Yaron, Agnon's daughter, who I had the privilege of knowing fairly well in the later years of her life, told me that this was curious because the fire did not take place on a Leil Shabbat, on a Friday night, on a Sabbath evening, and I had no way to understand how her memory differed from Laur's account that the fire takes place on June 6th. But very recently, in the last number of weeks, right before we all became distracted by the war, we were able to do some archival research. The fire, because it was Agnon at that point, was not a noteworthy enough figure that the German press was going to cover the story. The story was covered in the press because it was a noteworthy building which was burnt down. And by the way, you may know that it was a case of arson, that there was an insurance fire. Agnon's downstairs neighbor set an insurance fire which got out of control. But by looking through the newspapers of the time, we discovered that that the story was reported, and here we benefited from the help of the Bad Homburg Historical Society. Who knew there was such a thing? That in fact the Brand in der Villa Imperial is reported in the German press, and it's determined that the fire took place not on June 6th, but on the night of June 4th, 1924. It starts on the June 4th and burns really until the next morning. And this is important because it creates an interesting historical curiosity, one that I think would have entertained our friend Alan. You know that the relationship between Agnon and Kafka is a complex one. Agnon made outlandish claims that he'd hardly read Kafka, hardly knew Kafka. What's true is, it probably is true, the point made by Arnold Band that what's less important is whether or not Agnon had read Kafka, but the degree to which Kafka was not, in fact, the influence that was often ascribed, because it confuses points of similarity with points of influence. We don't have time now to go into expanding on that, but what is interesting, of course, is that Kafka dies on June 3rd. The fire takes place the very next day. How Don Lior came to make this mistake, I think I've also come to understand, and perhaps if I write this up, I will explain that. But it's almost a Kafka story itself. Of course, you know, Kafka leaves his last will and testament to his friend and executor, Max Brod, that his last request is that everything I leave behind, diaries, manuscripts, letters, sketches, and so on, should all be burned unread. Also, writings and sketches which you or others may possess. If I've sent letters to other people, burn that also. Everything has to go into the fire. And of course, we know exactly how carefully Max Brod carried out this request. He didn't burn anything at all. And in fact, after long legal battles, the manuscripts have made their way now to the National Library, where they can be the National Library here in Israel. That's a very interesting story in and of itself. But almost as if to say that the flames that went unfed with Kafka's writings had to find something else. And the very next day, those unsatisfied fires are ignited in Agnon's home. And Agnon never recovers from this. The fire that destroyed his library and his manuscripts in 1924 stayed with him, burned with him, preoccupied him, horrified him for the rest of his life. Years, decades later, standing in Stockholm, this is maybe the central thing that he points to in the Nobel Prize speech. He describes that when he was young, he had made many songs. Here, I assume he means poems, shirim, right? But Agnon's description of prose and poetry and song, these things sometimes blended in his descriptions. In fact, when he was very young, he did write poetry. As he matured, he realized that was not his strength, and he really moved to prose. But he says nothing has remained of those youthful writings. My father's house, where I left a room full of writings when he had gone off on Aliyah in 1908 as a 20-year-old, it was burned down in the First World War. And all I had left there was burned with it, meaning his youthful writings, things he had written and published in newspapers in Galicia and Poland and elsewhere. It all went up in flames in the First World War. All of the young artisans, tailors, and shoemakers of Buchach, who used to sing my songs at their work, they also went up in the flames. They were either killed in the First World War, or they and the beautiful young sisters that would sing, they also went up in flames, of course, in Auschwitz. So this idea of not only his writings, but the people for whom his writings were precious are all destroyed, expands in concentric circles the meaning of these lost writings, these lost books. The fate of those singers who, like my songs, went up in flames was also the fate of the books which I later wrote. And then he describes that in 1924 in Bad Homburg, the fire destroys the books that were burned, a large novel of 700 pages that he had in manuscript that he forgot to save on Google Drive. There was only one handwritten copy. This was a long novel called Bitzror HaChayim, here given the English title Eternal Life. This is the single greatest mystery in Agnon research. What was this novel? What would it have been? It was burned along with the manuscript. Everything he had written, the manuscripts, everything I had written since the day I had gone into exile from the land of Israel from 1912 to 1924, including an additional book he was writing with Martin Buber that was meant to be Agnon's contribution to Buber's Tales of the Hasidim, and 4,000 Hebrew books, his library of 4,000 books, most of which had come down to me from my forebears, and some of which I had bought with money set aside from my daily bread. And this never leaves him. He never recovers from this loss of the library. Then he suffers 5 years later the loss of the library he had resurrected when he returns to Jerusalem. And it occupies so many of his stories. The title story of Alan and Anne's collection that we're gathered here today to discuss, the writings, the piyut that Shlomo ibn Gabiro composes in memory of Buchach in the surrealistic story Hasiman, the sign, after the destruction of Buchach in the Holocaust, which is forgotten in this world, but is preserved in the celestial archive or library, giving it permanence. But I came to think in these last few weeks, I've been rereading Agnon's Adhena, which Wendy and I had the opportunity to travel this past summer with a group from Beit Agnon to Germany. And we spent some time there talking of Agnon's German novels. Adhena is Agnon's home front novel of the First World War during the years that he spends in Germany, the period, of course, where so many young German Jewish men give their lives in defense of the Vaterland. Of course, the ironies of that can be expanded on at another time. And in Adhena, into this day, the preoccupation with books is there as well. Much of the novel spins around the narrator, who we're meant to believe is a stand-in for Agnon himself, his responsibility to Dr. Levy, who has left behind Chadarim Mleim Sfarim, 2 big rooms in his house full of Hebrew texts. And who's going to take care of these books? What's going to become their fate? This preoccupation, of course, was so very much on Susanna, on your mind, and Beverly, you were involved in this and you write about it in the book. What's going to happen to Alan's library? And, and I myself am the beneficiary here. What have I done these past few weeks? My mind has turned to Bialik's Be'ir HaHarega, his epic poem of pogrom, and its sudden timeliness once again. And I pull off my shelves some of the books that I inherited from Alan, that Susanna was so kind to send me. with this sticker from Alan Mintz's personal collection. May these books bring you meaning and inspiration. His collections of books about Kishinev, and the volume that, David, I know you're sitting there, the volume of proof texts that the two of you co-edited about the century after Kishinev. So what happens to these books when somebody passes away? And the narrator is tasked with finding a solution to this problem. And of course, the only solution to this problem in a novel written in the 1950s, fully aware of what would happen to German Jewry, but set during World War I, the only solution is to move the library, like the Bate Knesset Uvate Midrashot, the synagogues and study halls of the diaspora, which will be uprooted and carried over to Jerusalem, to relocate those books to Jerusalem. But part of the idea is also what's going to happen to books and writings here in Germany. And this, of course, is very much on our minds now, and those of you in New York, and certainly for myself here in Medinat Yisrael, the degree to which traumatic times such as these are naturally going to have a very serious, deleterious effect on texts and reading and scholarship and learning and those people that are dedicated to it. The character Mittel, who's a German Jew, is saying he imagines a story in which nothing is left of Germany. Germany, the capital of culture, the capital of scholarship. Why? Because the nation is so poor, they can only think of where their next meal will come from. Their universities and libraries are converted into tenements, and all their books and works of art are burned for heating and cooking. In the end, not a page survives from all of German literature and philosophy. You say that one war can't do that to a great nation, but you know, one war leads to another. He's speaking about German culture. It's true for all societies should be concerned about this. The loss of books as physical objects, but books as culture, books as what they represent, books as the repositories of certain ideas. And this is something that we have to be very mindful of. It might not be our top priority today. We have to also save bodies, but books and their ideas are something that have to be protected. This all brings to mind, and here I'm coming to the end, the very well-known anecdote, I needn't read it, that Saul Bellow told on a number of occasions of his first visit to Agnon. This story probably is set in the late 50s or early 60s. Bellow first recorded it in the introduction to his collection, Great Jewish Short Stories, which was published in 63. Bellow comes to Jerusalem. Someone makes a connection between him and Agnon. They would have conversed in Yiddish, their only common language. Agnon did not yet know who Bellow was. Agnon himself had not yet won the Nobel, and Bellow would only receive it a few years after Agnon's death. But Agnon, unable to read in English, probably didn't really know or appreciate who this young Saul Bellow was. So Bellow says that Agnon asks him if any of his work had been translated into Hebrew. And if not, he better see to it immediately, because Agnon says they would only survive in the holy tongue. That in order to be an author who creates a lasting work of permanence, whose books will not be lost, they have to be preserved in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew. So Bellow says, this advice, I assume, was only half serious. This was his witty way of calling my attention to a curious situation. So I cited Heinrich Heine as an example of a poet who had done rather well in German. Ah, said Mr. Agnon, we have him beautifully translated into Hebrew. He is safe. Now, Agnon had very particular ideas about the Hebrew language. But he's also saying something about that celestial archive, where works which may or may not last here on earth have permanence when filed away in that celestial archive. Well, this brings us back to our friend Alan and to the two great books that have now been published in his memory, one a collection principally of his own writings, and the other essays about his work on Irum Loa and on Buchach. So whether or not Agnon is correct that only in Hebrew will works have enduring permanence in heaven. So if not in Hebrew, then at least we American Hebraists, we proud American Hebraists who walk in Alan's footsteps, who've been guided and influenced and inspired by him, who feel this passion to preserving a culture of that language, even as so many of us are occupied and preoccupied with doing so to people who are not encountering those texts in Hebrew. We too are working to create a celestial archive so that books and cultures and knowledge will not be lost, so that the city of Buchach, which no longer exists, has been rebuilt. Boneh anachnu ir. We have been occupied with rebuilding Agnon's city, his city of Buchach, his city of Yafo, his city of Yerushalayim, and even those cities of German Jewry that no longer exist. These were the paths that Alan set before us, and this is our task and challenge, which we all try to live up to today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. So we will go kind of in reverse alphabetical order from there, and we're our next speaker.
I'm sorry, Anne. I apologize. I'm going to try to stay on for a while. It's rather late here. I may not make it to the end.
Absolutely.
So I'll just say goodbye now, and thank you all for joining us, and especially thank you to the organizers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your thoughts. So Wendy Zierler will speak next, and this is her place, so she hardly needs an introduction, but I want to mention her wonderful books: Movies and Midrash, Popular Film, Jewish Religious Conversation, and Rachel Stovely Idols, The Emergence of Hebrew Women's Writing, and many, many articles, and most recently, which sounds like a really wonderful book, Going Out with Knots, My 2 Kaddish COVID Years with Hebrew Poetry. She's edited 2 recent books, These Truths We Hold, Judaism in an Age of Truthiness, yeah. And the one we're commemorating today, Building a City, writing in Agnon's Buchach in memory of Alan Mintz. And of course, she's co-editor now of Proof Texts, the journal that Alan and David founded. So here's the mic.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much to my friend Jeffrey Sachs for staying up so late to join us. It's really such an honor and a pleasure to welcome you all here to HUC-JIR for this event marking the publication of these 2 books in memory of our dear colleague and mentor, Professor Alan Mintz, Zichrono Livracha. This occasion brings together colleagues from different institutions, from different cities, from different countries. Jeffrey was supposed to have joined us in person. It means so much to all of us to have you all come together, to have all of us come together at this terrible time, difficult time for Am Yisrael, and on this eve of Kristallnacht. And it really means a lot to have Susanna and Amira and Avital with us tonight to commemorate this occasion, to mark this occasion. So it was 50 years ago, right before Yom Kippur, before the Yom Kippur War, that Ir Umloa, a city in its fullness, which was Agnon's monumental collection of stories about his hometown of Buchach. It was 50 years ago that it was posthumously published, edited by his daughter, Emuna Yaron. Alan Mintz's, the last part of his career was dedicated to this book, to Ir Umloa. And so the book sits at the titular center of the book that Sheila and Jeffrey and I edited in his memory. In Alan's last book, Ancestral Tales, his study of Iram Loa, he referred to the story Hasiman that Jeffrey mentioned early on in his presentation, translated as the sign. It was the final story in Iram Loa according to the order that Emuna Yaron compiled. Alan referred to that story, Hasiman, as the consecration story. In Hasiman, the narrator discovers on Erev Shavuot that the last vestiges of Jewish life in his hometown of Buchach have been destroyed by the Nazis. And the story thus pits the celebration of the giving of the Torah on the one hand against the revelation of the tragedy of the Shoah on the other. My former professor, Nita Ben-Dov, recent Israel Prize winner, has an essay in our volume about this ironic juxtaposition of revelation and inverse revelation, revelation of God's presence and revelation of God's absence. And that essay is especially meaningful to me because it brings together my earliest teacher, my first advisor at Princeton, with one of my later teachers, Alan, who played such a formative role for me as a teacher and a mentor. Alan explains in his book, Ancestral Tales, that the narrator of Hasiman undergoes a kind of transformative, mystical experience in which he's called upon to memorialize the lost community of Buchach, and to do so through the medium of narrative art. Now, Sefer She'avad, the story that we asked you to read for tonight, that Jeffrey mentioned, got edited out of the English collection of A City in Its Fullness. That story could just as well have been a candidate for the title of consecration story. In it, Agnon tells the story of the Buchach Dayan, a man named Rabbi Shmaria, guardian of God, and Rabbi Shmaria's composition of a commentary on the Magen Avraham, itself a commentary on the Orach Chaim, which is the section of the Shulchan Aruch dedicated to the laws of Shabbat and of the Jewish holidays. In other words, dedicated to the Jewish way of life. This idea of composing commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries is central to the story, Sefer She'avad, and to its imagining of the chain of literary tradition. Just as Rabbi Shmaria, however, is about to bind the completed commentary that he spent 12 years writing, just as he is submitting it to a bookbinder, he discovers at the very same moment that he's handing in his book another book that's been submitted to this same bookbinder. The book is called the Machatzit HaShekel, another commentary on the Magen Avraham, by Rabbi Samuel Halevi Low, and his dates are 1720 to 1806. The narrator, Rabbi Shmaria, looks at this commentary and decides he's been scooped. Everything that he wanted to contribute has already been contributed, even though the biblical tradition of Machatzit HaShekel implies that each one of us has something to contribute. The humble Rabbi Shmaria, the Dayan, deems that his contribution has already been made by somebody else, and so he shelves the whole project, consigning it to would-be oblivion. Now, of course, there's no way that this narrator, living in the early 20th century, some 4 to 5 generations after Reb Shmaria, this rabbi whose book never gets published, right? There's no way that this guy who happens upon the unbound, unpublished book by accident in the attic geniza of the old Beit HaMidrash in Buchach, there's no way that he could actually know the story of 18th century Reb Shmaria and his 12 years of working on this book. But that's precisely the point. The narrator's account is a work of literary imagination, or as Sheila will say, the work of reworking another story. The narrator goes from there, from telling of his happening upon this book, to tell us about reading in Alexander Zederbaum's modern Hebrew journal, Mintz Peh, by the way, the very same journal that the young Shmuel Yosef Chachka's published his very first poem in. He reads in Mintz about a very different sort of geniza that's being established. He reads as follows. He refers to this as Bet Asfarim Ginzei Yosef Shebirushalayim She'enit et Hasifriya Halaumit Ve'Hauniversitait. The Ginzei Yosef Library, which was the seed for the National Library of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he decides upon reading this to cobble together the money needed to rescue Reb Shmaria's manuscript and send it as a contribution from Buchach to the fledgling Jerusalem Library. To prepare this book for shipment, what does he do? He buys strong paper and a mishicha na'ah, a handsome cord. The somewhat odd choice of the word mishicha for cord, recalling Agnon's use of that same word for cord, for the cord that is tied to the goat in his famous 1925 story, Ma'aseh Ha'ez, Fable of the Goat, where a young boy trying to find out where this magic goat is disappearing to ties a mishicha na'ah on the zanav of the goat and then follows that goat into a magic cave and ends up in Tzfat, actually. So that same word shows up in this story with the Zionist suggestion that, of course, we can no longer wait for Mashiach in order to right the wrongs of the historical wrongs of Jewish life, but that we have to take and tie up matters in our own hands. Reb Shmaria, like I said, guardian of God's book, thus comes to stand for a whole majestic, lost world of Torah study, tradition, and devotion, which the narrator strives to relocate in the old new city of Jerusalem. Fast forward, upon moving to Palestine himself and visiting this library, Ginzei Yosef, the early beginnings of the National Library, the narrator discovers, as we all know, that the book that he had bound and staved to send somehow has been lost. But the writing of the story suggests that there is a role for modern Hebrew literature in all of this, that writing, imaginative writing, can step into this breach, continuing the tradition of Hebrew letters, dare I say halachic letters, and serve as a new Magen Avraham, or a new commentary on the shield of Avraham, or a new Machatzit HaShekel. As Jeffrey noted, Agnon himself knew what it was to lose books and obsessed about what it means to lose books, but then, of course, to make new books on the basis of those lost books. So books that are lost beget new books. Fabrications or inventions on the basis of traditions, of course, traditions and their disruptions, all of this makes new art. And insofar as a book that was lost serves as the title of the anthology that many years ago, we're so grateful for it, and Golomb, Hoffman, and Alan edited together, it serves not just as a key or an understanding to what generated, what drove Agnon's art, but also it provides a window into a number of the aspects of Alan's career that I want to share with you very briefly, both as shown in American Hebraist, the book of essays that Beverly and David edited, but also in our own collection of essays. And they are as follows. Number one, Alan's dedication from the very beginning of his career in the field of Hebrew literature to scholarly and editorial projects such as proof texts, which I now have the privilege of co-editing, to projects that span the whole sweep of Jewish literary history, from the Bible to the present, thereby creating continuities in the face of discontinuities. Number two, his determination himself to rescue lost or under-acknowledged books. First, the genre of Hebrew autobiography, then the whole corpus of American Hebrew literature, and finally Agnon's Buchach stories, which he tried to bring a new, renewed interest to. I would add a third aspect of his career, namely his commitment as a faculty member at JTS to the importance of modern Hebrew literature in the curriculum and the training of liberal rabbis, a legacy that I have to say feels threatened by the current lack of full-time modern Jewish literature faculty at any other liberal seminary other than HUC-JIR at the moment. I have to say that my whole goal as a scholar and a teacher and as a disciple of Alan Mintz has been to argue that modern Jewish and modern Hebrew literature can serve as an important new layer of commentary on our classical tradition. Its creativity is vital and ought to be considered a canonical element in our curricula. There's a sly line in Agnon's Sefer She'avad, where the narrator refers to himself at that very moment when he finds Rabbi Shmariah's manuscript as having lost interest in studying Torah, and he says, why? Mipnei otam asfarim haktanim she'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu mabit bahem. Because of those little books that God doesn't deign to look upon, namely, works of modern Hebrew, prose, and poetry. But Agnon, of course, we know, and Alan, of course, we know, they both dedicated their lives to these Sfarim Haktanim. And Alan himself, as previously mentioned, he excelled at bringing together groups of scholars and students in various contexts, from Brandeis, JTS, University of Maryland, everywhere. I have to say, I myself brought a little baby to Brandeis to attend one of those summer seminars. He brought people together for that very purpose of reading modern Hebrew literature together. And so our gathering here at HUC today to discuss this story from Agnon's Ir Umlo'ah, it's not just to celebrate the publication of these books, which we're very proud of, but also to model and disseminate the kind of pedagogy and Torah that Alan labored at so assiduously and elegantly and with such humble dedication, such quiet eloquence, so that chas v'chalila, these books, these Sfarim Ktanim, but, Gdolim, should never, God forbid, be lost.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, I think this gathering, beginning with food and drink, and we'll gather afterwards, I think, really exemplifies everything that you're talking about. This is how it works. And the food is part of it, as Alan knew so well. So our next speaker is David Roskies, who is Emeritus Professor of Yiddish Literature and Culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And as we know, in 1981, with Alan, he co-founded Proof Texts, a journal of Jewish literary history. And for 18 years, David served as editor-in-chief of the New Yiddish Library. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012. And just this past year, he launched the online open access archive, All Things Yiddish, and an expanded edition of Yiddish Lands, a Memoir, was published by Wayne State University Press. With that, David.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Alan, for bringing us together in exactly the way that you envisaged, by creating a community of readers through the study of an exemplary text. So I just want you to know that I put on a tie in your honor. I have 3 observations to share in this communal reading of ours. The first is that Sefer She'avad does not mean a book that was lost. It means a sefer, a sacred tome that was lost. And therein lies the central tension and challenge in Alan's life and in his writing and in his teaching. Secondly, that the narrator's self-fashioning in the story is key to its meaning, exactly as Alan argued in his study of Ir Umlo'ah. And from that insight, I want to offer a reading of Alan's life in light of the Agnon persona. And finally, because there is a slippage between Sefer as book and Sefer as sacred tome, everything we learn about the making and rediscovery and loss of the manuscript has much to tell us about Agnon's literary aspirations and also Allen's. So, first, it's not the lost book, but the lost Sefer, the sacred tome. This is a distinction, of course, that does not exist in English or even in Hebrew, but does exist in Agnon's native language, Yiddish, which was the only language that Agnon spoke with a native accent. And the same holds true for the Sofer Ivri, a Hebrew scribe, but it could also mean, in Hebrew, a modern Hebrew writer. But in Yiddish, there is no such ambiguity, because a Sofer and a Schreiber inhabit two vastly different worlds. It's possible to bridge the worlds of Sofer and Sofer only in Hebrew. So that's what we're really talking about here. In this story, the lost Sefer is actually handwritten. It's kind of like a scroll. It's unique. It's not like a book, which is replicable, which is merely a commodity. It is a sacred tome, and because it's sacred, even if it is abandoned, even if it's torn, it has to be accorded a proper burial, either in a geniza, in the attic of the old synagogue in Buchach, where our narrator finds it, or, he says, among the graves of the stillborn, another place that torn sacred fragments are kept in the city of Buchach. So that's the question that Agnon is posing. Is this handwritten Sefer stillborn, or can it be saved? Can these dead bones be brought back to life? Allen was always keenly aware of the difference between secular book and sacred tome. He understood that this was one of the major fault lines in Jewish literary history, and that's what he wrote an essay about called Modern Hebrew Literature and Jewish Theology. And it's the 10th chapter of the collection in American Hebraist. So that he understood was the central tension, Hebrew literature and what he calls here Jewish theology. But the same held true in pedagogical practice. So in 1990, he gives this talk at the National Association for Professors of Hebrew called The Erosion of the Tarbut Ivrit Ideology in America and the Consequences for the Teaching of Hebrew in the University. And there he argues very cogently that Hebrew is not synonymous with the state of Israel and its secular forms of self-expression. But the first principle must be, when you're teaching, is the conception of Hebrew as the central manifestation of the Jewish people throughout the generations, and therefore Hebrew as the key to Jewish civilization. And I would add, obviously, he means Jewish religious civilization. So the two have to be linked in your thinking, in your conceptualization, and in the classroom. Therefore, a Hebrew book, Sefer Ivri, must partake of the Hebrew Sefer, the sacred book, in order to be worthy of preservation. Therefore, a scholar of Hebrew, of the Hebrew book, must never lose sight of the crucial distinction between the sacred and the secular. And therefore, a teacher of Hebrew must use the classroom as a utopian space in which, if possible, the two worlds can be reconciled. Secondly, the role of the narrator in this story, or what, this professional lingo that we use, the self-fashioning of the narrator as key to its meaning. Almost every Agnon story is a tale of two cities. It's Buchach and Yerushalayim. So here he appears as a chronicler of Old Buchach, especially its scholars, and we already heard the first character we meet is Shmariah the Dayan, and the scholars who inspired him, like the Magen Avraham. Then, in the next part of the story, we meet the narrator as a young man growing up in Buchach, and he portrays himself as a local historian, as an ethnographer, as a budding scholar of rabbinic literature. He is the one who discovers this manuscript in the attic of the old Beit Midrash. He alone understands its originality. So imagine the Hebrew literacy you have to possess in order to decipher this manuscript and say, wow, he really had something new to say. But as a loyal son of Buchach, he has to seek corroboration from his elders. So he goes running to his father and to other scholars to ask, did I really get it right? Did I really get it right? So that's the narrator's self-portrayal as a young man. And then we see him coming of age as a Zionist dreamer and as a Jewish rebel. He has to deceive his parents in order to scrape together enough money for postage to mail the manuscript to Yerushalayim, to Ginzei, to this redemptive act of saving Hebrew books and Hebrew manuscripts. And that's where he gives away the fact that he is already growing disenchanted with the world of Torah. And on the sly, without his parents knowing, reading these little books that are forbidden. The narrator's first act of agency, real agency, is to head off to the post office, it means he has to negotiate their world and speak their language in order to mail this manuscript to Yerushalayim. And then as he looks around to see who else is in the post office, he realizes he is the only Jew in town who is interested in matters of the spirit. Everyone else is in the post office to conduct business, but not him. Jerusalem for him is the lodestar of desire. It's Ginzei Yerushalayim, and even the Gentile postmaster has to acknowledge that there is such a place as Jerusalem in a country called Palestine. And finally, we see the narrator in the land of Israel. And ironically, with a great deal of self-irony, the narrator says, well, I had to undergo a divine test because I tarried for a year in godless Yafo before actually making Aliyah to Yerushalayim, where he arrives Erev Tisha B'Av. So, of course, this is extremely loaded. But what does he do? He goes sightseeing and eventually ends up in Ginzei, in the library. But his companions, as he sightsees, make fun of him. Why did he send off this package? And he says, I belong to something that was called the second Aliyah. And these were people who wanted to sever their ties with the past. So he gets to the library and he describes in minute detail what's in this manuscript, but the manuscript is nowhere to be found. And then we find out at the very end of the story that he keeps going back to the library again and again, and he meets librarians who are completely indifferent to the fate of this manuscript until he stops going because it was lost forever. So for Alan, his utopian dream was probably not too far away from sitting in the old Beit Midrash in Buchach and dreaming of Jerusalem. I can see Alan. I can actually see him doing that. And like Alan, who sowed his wild oats in the secular city and got himself a doctorate in English literature from Columbia, but he ultimately passed the divine test and made his final ascent to the Upper West Side and became a full professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and his office was next door to mine. And like Shmuel Yosef Chachkes, he refashioned himself as a Jewish scholar and champion of the Jewish literary imagination. So I want to honor him, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, David. So our next speaker is Sheila Jelen, who has just arrived from Prague, bearing mysterious secrets to share with us. And Sheila is Zanker Professor of Jewish Literature, Culture, and History at the University of Kentucky, Lexington, and she directs Jewish studies there. She is the author of Salvage Poetics, American Jewish Post-Holocaust Folk Ethnographies, and Intimations of Difference, Dvorah Baron in the Modern Hebrew Renaissance. She has edited numerous books, including Reconstructing the Old Country, American Jewry in the Post-Holocaust Decades, Modern Jewish Literatures, Intersections and Boundaries, and Hebrew Gender and Modernity. Her most recent book, Israeli Salvage Poetics, explores the ways in which Israeli writers and scholars have represented Eastern European Jewish life in their work from the 30s to the present. And of course, she's co-editor of proof texts and of one of the volumes we are celebrating tonight.
I'm an associate editor, not, yeah. Thank you so much. Before I launch into my formal remarks, I just want to say thank you to HUC for hosting this wonderful event. It's just wonderful to see familiar and new faces in the audience. And I also want to acknowledge that I wouldn't be here or who I am today without Alan. He was a real mentor to me, even though he never taught me in a classroom. And I felt his loss very, very acutely, and I still do to this day. So I want to begin actually with a distant text in classic Midrashic tradition. Abraham Joshua Heschel ends his book, The Earth is the Lord's, with the following tale. Rabbi Isaac Meir Alter of Ger, the outstanding Talmudic scholar in Poland of his day, came to his master, Rabbi Mendel of Kotsk, and asked him to read the manuscript of a work he had written. It was a commentary on Choshen Mishpat, the Jewish civil code. A few weeks later, the rabbi of Kotsk sent for the author. I have studied your manuscript, he said. It is a work of genius. When published, the classical commentaries, which have been studied for generations, will become obsolete. I am only grieved at the thought of the displeasure which this will cause to the souls of the saintly commentators. It was a winter evening. Fire was burning in the stove. Rabbi Isaac Meir took the manuscript from the table and threw it into the flames. So without doing a close reading of this very rich story, both on its own terms and within the context of Abraham Joshua Heschel's literary and spiritual biography, I wanted to preface my remarks with this because of what I view as Agnon's profound engagement, and by extension, Alan's profound engagement with the ideas embedded within it. The value of interpretation, of authorship, and of community lie at the heart of this story and can carry us into the story that we are discussing today as we celebrate Alan's life and the publication of these books in his memory. Agnon's A Book That Was Lost, or Sefer She'avad, tells a similar story, and you've heard it summarized like 4 times now. I'm going to summarize it again. I'm too tired to make adaptations because I woke up in Prague this morning, sorry. In it, the narrator speaks about a book authored by a scholar from his hometown, Buchach. Rabbi Shmarya Hadayan seeks to preserve and disseminate a book of scholarship authored by the Magen Avraham on the halachic text Orach Chaim from the Shulchan Aruch by Yosef Karo. In a similar vein, the Hasidic tale that I just read to you speaks of a commentary on the Choshen Mishpat, which can also be found in the Shulchan Aruch. When Shmarya Hadayan finishes his manuscript, he wants to publish it, but the publisher happens to be working on another manuscript at that time, one that does exactly what Shmarya Hadayan seeks to do, to elucidate the text of Magen Avraham on Orach Chaim. Thus, Shmarya Hadayan decides not to have his book bound and leaves it in manuscript form in the Geniza of the Buchach synagogue. Generations later, the narrator of our story discovers this manuscript, reads it, declares it to be a valuable contribution to the body of commentaries on the Magen Avraham's gloss on Orach Chaim, and decides to send it to Jerusalem, to the Ginzei Yosef Library, a harbinger of the National Library of Jerusalem, in the hopes that they will bind it, catalog it, and put it on their shelf for all to read. Eventually, the narrator finds his own way to Jerusalem. He seeks to ascertain whether his book has arrived, but it cannot be found. Like so many of Agnon's stories about misdirection, loss, and perseveration, Sefer Sha'avad highlights the gap between the world of East European Jewry and the world of Eretz Yisrael. In Ma'aseh Ha'ez, or the Tale of the Goat, a tunnel between the diaspora and the land of Israel is traversed by a goat and a boy, and is then lost, severing ties between the boy and his father, between the shtetl and the promised land. In Pat Shlema, El Harofeh, and Ha'otobus Ha'acharon, we follow a narrator on a journey to nowhere. In Agunot, Agnon's most famous of stories, a bridegroom from diaspora cannot satisfy the needs of a bride in Eretz Yisrael, and a world of pain results. What are we to make of Agnon's version of the story of the Rebbe of Ger's burnt manuscript? What does the connection between the two stories tell us about our late friend Alan Mintz and the project he undertook at the end of his life to bring to light in the English-speaking world to bring light in the English-speaking world to the special body of interconnected short stories about Buchach published by Agnon's daughter Emuna Yaron after Agnon's death? Alan Mintz followed in a long line of Jewish scholars who sought, like Rabbi Shmarya Hadayan, to illuminate the texts of his predecessors. Even so, his final published work was as much about Alan as it was about Agnon and about Buchach. It was the impulse to make readily available Jewish texts and Jewish scholarship which led to him founding Proof Texts with our colleague David. As I understand it, Alan's final book, the literary autobiography he was in the process of writing at the time of his death, has been largely lost to us. And so in our grief, the people represented by the editors of the two books we celebrate today gathered in the days after Alan's death, not to finish the work Alan started, but to disseminate as much of it as we could, to continue it and to honor it. The two books we are here to launch are the product of that resolve. With them, we celebrate Alan. There is, of course, a huge element of loss in what we are doing today, the loss of Alan, the loss of his unfinished autobiography. But like the narrator of Agnon's story, who tells us about the lost manuscript and continues the tradition of interpretation and authorship begun by Shmarya Hadayan by just speaking of it, what we are doing here will, I hope, accomplish something similar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. So our last speaker before we open up for more conversation is Beverly Bailis, and Beverly teaches courses in modern Jewish literature at JTS. She specializes in modern Hebrew literature and Jewish literature and gender studies. She's taught at Brooklyn College, the Women's League, the JCC in Manhattan, and other adult education programs in New York. She has published in Proof Texts and elsewhere, And one recent article of note is Reading the Poetry of Mahmoud Darwish in the Transnational Classroom, which appeared in a volume on teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict in the college classroom. She is, as we know, co-editor with David Stern of American Hebraist, and of course she was Alan's last doctoral student. Beverly.
Hi, thank you, Anne, and thank you everyone for being here. It is an honor today to be with all of you to commemorate the publication of these two anthologies dedicated to the work of Alan Mintz. David Stern and I co-edited American Hebraist, Essays on Agnon and Modern Jewish Literature, in order to gather together essays, articles, and book chapters from different moments in Alan's career in a volume. Since David could not be here tonight, I wanted to emphasize that he knew that Alan had intended to publish such a volume of his collected works, and it is therefore apt to be marking this book launch with the editors of Building a City through the lens of an Agnon story that is about publishing a book on the behalf of others. I will speak today as a former doctoral student of Alan's to consider Agnon's story, a book that was lost, as a way to think about the transmission of knowledge and culture from teachers to students across generations, and in particular to reflect on Alan's teaching style and what it was able to open up for me as a scholar and teacher. I will begin by focusing on an event in the story that resonated for me, which is the first moment when something goes amiss. The narrator explains that it took Rabbi Shmaria 12 years to complete his commentary on Rabbi Gomener's commentary, Magen Avraham. We learn that the Magen Avraham was an enigmatic and complex text, especially because its author was poor and needed to write his commentary on walls, tables, and scraps of paper in a kind of shorthand. The story relates that at the end of 12 years, Rabbi Shmaria left no difficult passage of this text uninterpreted. He checked and found nothing further to add. He then sent for the bookbinder to bind the sheets and delighted in the thought of printing and publishing his book. The wholeness and perfection of this commentary, which is underscored later in the story when it is referred to by the narrator as a chibur shalem, causes Rabbi Shmaria to feel nothing less than delight, or as the Hebrew reads, misha'ashea atzmo b'da'ato. This is the moment, however, when things go awry. A devastating coincidence occurs when Rabbi Shmaria brings his commentary to the bookbinder, only to find a new book by another scholar on the Magen Avraham. We learn that when Rabbi Shmaria fixed his gaze on the book again and again, he found it a most satisfactory commentary, most satisfactory, apt and with a ring of truth. He then concludes, I have been preceded by another, there is no need for my work. This somewhat odd and unexpected moment of self-doubt, and Rabbi Shmaria's belief that his commentary had nothing original to add, thus sets off the story's events. Even though the commentary is discovered 4 or 5 generations later by the story's narrator, who finds it in fact worthy of publishing, suggesting that not only was the commentary innovative in its time, but remained innovative generations later, it is this initial moment of doubt that creates an impediment that precludes the commentary's availability to future readers, both in the diaspora, in Buchach, and later in the land of Israel. What interests me in this passage, and I admit to a certain extent to be reading the story against the grain, is on the one hand, the expression of admiration and sheer pleasure of the Jewish textual tradition and the act of interpreting and teaching, of engaging and participating in this tradition. At the same time, this passage highlights the humility and the other humanness and vulnerability felt before these texts and the scholarship of others and the anxiety that one has nothing new to offer. Alan and I often spoke about such a range of feelings, of what it meant to be a scholar and literary critic and to join in Jewish studies discourse. We spoke about Hebrew and what it meant to come to the field of Hebrew literature as a non-native Hebrew speaker. This is a topic that Alan explored with a sense of honesty and vulnerability in autobiographical essays that appear in both of these new anthologies. The essay, My Life with Hebrew, featured in the anthology Building a City, and Hebrew in America, a memoir, appears in American Hebraist. In these essays, he expresses the excitement, pleasure, and challenge of learning Hebrew, coupled with the fact that acquiring a second language at the level necessary to engage complex literary texts will always be an act in progress. It will never be perfect. Allen would also speak about coming from the field of English literature and retooling for Jewish studies, which entailed learning traditional texts from the Bible onward as a somewhat dizzying undertaking since it constituted a whole world. We marveled at how reading modern Hebrew literature involved knowledge of everything that was written until the moment of the literary work at hand, especially when tackling the work of writers like Agnon with all of the intertextual resonances, not to mention the intratextual references to other works of Agnon, which in and of itself constitutes a whole world. Allen likewise mentored me about how to enter the discourse of modern Hebrew literature, since so much has been written by other formidable scholars like Dam Yaron and Gershon Shaked and others, and it was hard not to feel scooped, just like Rabbi Shmaria felt. Allen counseled me on the need to learn discernment and to ask, is what I want to say the same thing as what another scholar has said, just said differently? Or is what I'm saying in fact different, a chiddush? For academic work includes not just evaluating the work of others, but we must evaluate our own work, which can be so hard to see objectively. Finding that balance between I've said it all and what I have is perfect, and I've said nothing of importance, nothing original, is how we find our own voice and come to know our own worth. This balance in turn demonstrates respect for colleagues and students, since to come across as I've said everything leaves no room for others, and to say there is no need for my work leads to a negation of the self. This awareness, along with the knowledge that there is never the final word, never nothing more to say about a text or idea, is what I try to bring to my classroom to allow space for new ideas, for curiosity, and for the pleasure of text, just as Allen provided space for me. I have one more paragraph, but I need some water. In closing, this opportunity to contribute and engage with texts was highlighted to me by two different but somewhat related approaches I encountered as a student on the one hand and as a teacher on the other. As you may know, one of the many important and imaginative contributions Allen made to the study of Agnon was his map of Buchach, which he designed with Jeffrey Sachs and that also appears in American Hebraist and in several other volumes. And he actually had it on his, hanging in his office and then on the door of his office as well. This map helps readers literally orient themselves in Agnon's world. On the other end, when reading Agnon's A Simple Story with students in a Hebrew literature class at JTS, without knowledge of Allen and Jeff's map, one of my students created a travel guide to Shibush, representing Buchach. This guide helps readers orient themselves in the city. So he made this walking tour through the perspective of Mina, one of the novel's marginal female characters. Like Allen's map, this guide helps readers orient themselves in the city and gain insight into the characters in Agnon's world. These two imaginative works, which somehow act as bookends in my role as student and teacher, demonstrate to me the relevance of continuing to grapple with texts and finding ways to make them our own and relevant to our own time. That is what Allen did for our generation of students at JTS, and to build on Wendy's earlier comments, that is what is at risk of being lost by not including modern Jewish literature in a Jewish studies and in a Jewish seminary context.
Thank you, Beverly. And why don't we open up the conversation now? You are welcome. I'm picturing a line of people at the microphone. Or come and take it. Yeah, please.
Or you can take that one.
So thank you very much. This was like really fascinating and fun, and it's important to hear a story at least 4 times before you let it sink in. So it's more of a opening up to conversation as opposed to a particular question. And thankfully, I'm not a modern Hebrew literature scholar, so I'm totally unburdened by prior scholarship. It's great.
It's not too late.
I'm working on the medieval period. I'll get there one day. What struck me, though, is the title of the story, Sefer She'avad. It's being translated here in the text as the book that was lost, but going back to sort of biblical Hebrew lexicography, which Agnon knew a lot about, avad does mean lost, but it also means to wander. Arami oved avi, at least in its biblical sense and not in its midrashic sense, as my father was a wandering Aramean. Shaul's donkeys are wandering. That's why he goes to seek prophetic counsel. So I'm wondering to what degree Agnon is deliberately choosing that title to play on not just the fact that in the end of the story the book is lost, but I detect a lot of themes of wandering in the narrative. The book wends its way from Buka to Jerusalem. And Agnon, if he is the Sefer, and they are, it clearly says, Ani v'hi kshura l'Yerushalayim, like the second half of the story is Agnon's peregrinations in Yerushalayim. So again, just an observation that the title may do a lot more work than just lost.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful observation, and certainly the peregrinations continue, right, and come to include us.
So the last sentence in Hebrew reads, and it's an answer, I think this is a partial answer to your question, Chaval al Sefer She'avad. So that Chaval al Da'avdin u'delo mishtakrin is what you say when you hear about somebody dying. So I think, at least on the pshat level, Agnon really wants to underscore the finality of it. And it's a brilliant ending. It turns this story into a sipur mitapech. I don't know if there is such a term because there's a shir mitapech, but this is a story. Sipur mitapech means you're reading the story and it builds up an expectation in the reader that surely the redemptive moment has got to come because we've been following the peregrinations and the wanderings so carefully. And then the last sentence says, no, it will never be found again. And so the ending is anti-redemptive, to put it mildly. And then what it does is it forces you to reread the story in the light of the last sentence. And that's when you begin picking up on other allusions that you would never have noticed. So in the Hebrew, but he keeps using the phrase, twice, he refers to the manuscript as Tachrich shel dapim. He uses the word Tachrich. Tachrichim are shrouds. So of course that's untranslatable. In the first instance, it's translated as the bookbinder brings a sheaf of pages, Tachrich shel dapim. And later in the story, the narrator says, but I said to myself, what good would it do to copy it over? That would only mean another bundle of writings, Tachrich, the same word, that would drift from place to place, and at best would end up in a place where worn-out books were laid to rest. So he decides not to copy it. So there's something inherent to the process, which bespeaks doom and the impossibility of actually achieving redemption. That's what makes this so compelling.
You know, just to counterpose to that, though, it's also a material object, and it's a story about the postal service, and it's about twine and physical objects moving in space, and that's sort of the messy, imperfect world we inhabit, right?
Yeah, I would just add that the title Tachrich Shel Sipurim became the title of another one of the posthumously published volumes of Agnon. So it's hard to know. I'd have to check when Jeffrey's not on the line right now.
He says, I wrote about this someplace else. So that's what he says in our story.
Most of what got posthumously published was, squirreled away in a box with all kinds of notes of what Agnon wanted. So I imagine that Agnon, in using that tahrikh, was playing on this. That it's meant to connote this idea of chaval da'avdin in a such a final sense, and yet it's a binding. It's a binding of sipurim that can get rebound and recirculated.
I just want to add one small thing about that wonderful insight about lostness, right? Wandering. When I first wrote my remarks, I shared them with Jeffrey, and I had listed a few other stories where I see this motif of never finding one's way, always deferring arrival, which is one of the things I find most fascinating about Agnon's work. And Jeffrey said to me, oh, it's not really in that story or that story. So, think about it in terms of this story and that story. And I was just thinking about the different ways that one can interpret wandering, right? And I still stand by what I think are stories of wandering that Jeffrey doesn't agree with. I think it permeates the entire corpus of his work, even when it's not obvious.
So thank you all. It was really terrific. And I just have a number of kind of random thoughts that came to my head as I was listening to you. And I think they're somewhat obvious, but I want to elevate them. One is, watching and listening, you all were going deeper and deeper into the same story. Whoever had the idea to read one story and then have us hear repeated tellings of it, I think made the point very nicely about what Alan was doing and what this story was saying. Then I was suddenly popped in my head that his first work that David mentioned is Middlemarch, George Eliot. He studied George Eliot, and one of my terrors in my life as a scholar is that character in Middlemarch, Casaubon, who spent his whole life writing something that never got published. And so I wondered, what did Alan think about him, and how did that permeate all his stories about books that continually did get published? And then the last thing I wanted to say, what was the last thing I wanted to say to you? When I first read the story for this night, I thought, okay, so who was the character of Agnon, and who was the character of Alan, and who was the character of the fellow who ended up in Yerushalayim looking for the book that never was found? And all of you are that, I think. And so again, I'm sure you did this purposefully, but it was a wonderful way to celebrate him. So thank you. And what was the very last thing I wanted to say? It slipped my mind. Let me think. What? Yeah, I'm wandering now, so I better stop.
So I know how much you love Middlemarch.
Yes.
Ace and I are in a book club together. And what's important to know about, well, among the many things, that Alan's work on George Eliot culminated in a book, his first book, which was called George Eliot's Novels of Vocation. And so David Stern so eloquently talks about the significance of what that means for Alan to have worked on the idea of vocation, that work was not just something that you did, but it was where you found yourself in your purpose. And that he went through George Eliot as a way of finding his vocation as a professor of Hebrew literature. And so I would say that the Casaubon character is an object lesson, the thing that we all get scared about and have nightmares and pictures of dread at night. But Alan lived his life around this idea that there was a purpose for him in the work that he did. Otherwise, you can't explain his incredible productivity and his tireless effort to bring people together. He really cared. He thought that it mattered to have all these people, younger people, older people, continue this work as a matter of vocation.
Absolutely, and I remember the last thing I wanted to say, thanks to your conversation, Wendy. The new National Jewish Library is about to open. It was going to open and it's delayed, but so the idea that that also made it into this is really precious to me, so.
I just had one comment in response to your remarks, Ace, about the structure of this presentation. One thing about Alan that I really admired was his humility. He was such a humble man, and when he taught, it was never about him. And when we were trying to figure out how to do this, it just felt really important for it not to be about us, but for it to be about Agnon and about Alan, because Alan would have wanted it to be about Agnon. So that's why we chose to do it this way. And Ace, I appreciate your positive evaluation of the result. Thank you so much.
So I apologize. I have to leave just after, but thank you so much. And I just wanted to. I guess one just question of something strange that I noticed now that we read it, and maybe it's because of all the terrible events that are happening now in Israel, Palestine. There is a very strange line in the story, and I'm not sure what to do with it. But it's like it's in Hebrew, when he's in Buchach and sending in this post office, he says, כתבתי על הנייר את שם הגבאי בית הספרים גנזי יוסף ואת שם ירושלים. זאת הפעם כתבתי את שם ירושלים שלא לשווא, והוספתי את שם הארץ פלסטינה ולא ארץ ישראל, זכר לחורבן. It's very strange to say that, and I don't know what to make of it, but I think, some of it is, everything that is going on now, that it is Israel, it is Palestine, you cannot really separate it. And I think it's also connected to the idea of, what he says. David referred to it kind of with self-irony about second Aliyah and how in those days, in order to be a rebel, to be second Aliyah, you have to forget where you came from. But I didn't, right? He didn't. And I think all of these things are really connected in a very complicated way about what is Khurban, what is lost, and what can be still found. And so that's one thing that is about the story. And then the other, it's been said already so many times, but I'm still going to say it again, that one of the things that always amazed me about Alan, because it was so, he never spoke about it, he never really made much of it. Like Sheila, and unlike Beverly, I was not his student in any formal way. And yet, from the moment that I met him for the first time until his death, he felt himself as a mentor to me, and I felt that he was my mentor, even though we didn't have any formal. And I thought that this was just me, right? I knew it was also Sheila, but it's only at the very end of his life, and even after he passed away, that I started to hear from so many people that I thought, no, that's impossible. This work of these young scholars who have nothing to do with Agnon or with, and they told me how much they had the same relationship. So yeah, I think there is something. I don't have to add anything to that. It's obvious how important it is and how admirable it is and how much it was like we didn't even know about all of that. But I think it's also connected to these themes that we are talking about, what is lost and what still connects, right? Because this story ends with Chaval al Sefer She'avad and also like people who are lost and are not with us. But through this mentorship and through this care about modern Hebrew literature and modern Jewish literature, it continues to live in all kinds of ways that I think even all of us still don't know, and we will continue to discover.
Yes. Thank you
Absolutely.